Hello and welcome to another episode of Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students brought to you by UJS. I'm Dora, the UJS Sabbatical Officer for Inclusion, Holocaust Education, and Jewish Engagement and Enrichment.
And I'm Claire from Royal Central School of Speech and Drama Jewish Society. Today we are honored to be joined by Rob Rinder.
Rob has been at the forefront of both Jewish and LGBT plus advocacy, and therefore we are privileged to have him joining us this month on the podcast. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your Jewish identity growing up.
Wow. So it's a topic I've written about a lot and talked about a lot. It's my Jewish identity growing up almost feels like a sort of curious question. It's completely inextricably linked to who I am. I grew up in a North London, what would now be a kind of modern Orthodox, but it still was a modern Orthodox United Synagogue community in Southgate, Cockfosters, and would go to shul most weeks. And it was a kind of a sort of religious community insofar as we would keep most of the chagim. My grandfather was a survivor, which I've spoken about a lot, and had the gift of making work and sharing with the broad community and communities across the country in various work for the BBC. But in terms of my Jewish identity, it was a very proud, central feature of who I am within the context of a blended community around me. So it was very unusual for people to go to Jewish school. There were a few in my neighborhood, but that was always the exception rather than the rule as it is now. So I went to a standard state school. And in the area I grew up in, which was kind of what you would understand in my bit of Southgate, kind of working class and first or second generation communities from across a variety of different backgrounds. We all went to the same school, and my Jewish social life sort of was centered around youth club and synagogue on Shabbat. And I was also kasher until I was probably about 12 or 13. So as you can imagine, as is, what I've spoken and written a lot about, it's a proud and completely safe, and that's important in the context of, I suspect, what we'll come and talk about, aspect of who I was. But as I say, alongside a variety of other communities, all of whom lived in delightful peace with one another.
And you went to university in Manchester.
I did, yeah.
What was your university experience like as a student?
Well, I went to Manchester for my first. Well, I went to a variety of universities, but my first degree I did in Manchester at a time when it was really cool to go to Manchester. I'm sure it's cool now to go to Manchester as well, but the scene that was happening musically, culturally, it was a kind of moment in the mid-90s where there's explosion of kind of cultural stuff all emanating from that part of our country, and so it was incredible to see what was going on. You could go and see plays. My eventual very closest friend, Benedict Cumberbatch, was acting every night, and a friend of mine who I'm still on university at WhatsApp group is a very famous Hollywood editor. And I don't give you that for name drop clunks. Safe to say it was just this explosion of talent that all gravitated to that part of the world at that time. It was great. Sadly, I wasn't part of any of that because I just wasn't cool at all. So my sport was university debating, which we got quite good at. Yeah, we got good at that at Manchester, and I enjoyed it. And also, it was really kind of, because it'd been after A-levels, I'd been quite switched on, let's say, academically, and I really got invested in the course that I was doing, and at some point was probably toying with the idea of carrying on at university to be an academic. And one year, I was the chair of the JSOC board. Antonia Voss, if you're listening to it, I don't know why she co-opted me in, but she did. It was a massive event. Maybe she thought I'd be good at organizing parties. yeah.
And
Which I
were you?
suppose. Well, I mean, it was a great event. I mean, what could I tell you? I don't actually remember much about it. Um, JSOC was a really big organization at Manchester. Manchester had always had a strong and rich tradition of Jewish students from across the country going there. It had a brimming Jewish life, and yeah, I mean, I went to shul a few times, and again, there was nothing really kind of unusual or threatening about my identity. It was a proud element of who I was, not necessarily the central feature, but a delightful incidental aspect of me, let's say. That and Hillel House, which was run by Rabbi YY, I think still going actually. Again, was a vibrant center of Jewish life. And actually, really interesting. I was there, I think, in my third year. It was the first time that I'd encountered. I don't think I've spoken about this. There was a motion brought by one of the societies. I suspect, but I can't say for sure, it was one of the Islamic societies, but I don't recall. And this is early as the mid-90s, so it's nothing new nowadays, that had brought a motion ostensibly suggesting, or not suggesting, which included the principle that Zionism was racism. And so I was there in it must have been 90, I don't know, 98 maybe, when they tried effectively to shut the JSOC down. And that galvanized Jewish communities and allies, even at that time. So we were facing that at that time. The backdrop was different, but the seeds of these ideas had emerged even then.
Wow, it's amazing how nothing changes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I mean, it was one of those things you can have within your it's perfectly possible to have an Islamic society which has that as its fundamental core as a belief, let's say. But they weren't satisfied with that being part of the advocacy within their community. What they wanted to do was not just ostensibly, as I say, they were determined to shut down the Jewish society, which within its fundamental framework couldn't have operated under the university constitution. Pretty bad stuff. So to say, it's got more dangerous, it's got more vocal. Don't forget, we had no social media at the time, nothing like that. The world has fundamentally changed, no mobile phones. And so how people communicate, experience the world, how they feel, how safe they are, how you can galvanize groups and allies. All of those things have radically shifted. But nevertheless, the ideas, let's say, that are now very much in the spaces that you're dealing with and managing were alive and breathing then.
Thank you for sharing that. And then since it is LGBTQ plus History Month, we have questions about your identity as a gay man, and I was curious about how that's changed kind of throughout your life. For instance, I read in an interview you did with The Guardian, you said, "When I realized I was gay, HIV, AIDS was a death sentence, a looming shadow." And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, this is a huge discussion, and I'm really glad you asked about it. And it's interesting, it's in the context of LGBTQ History Month. I don't think, or it's very difficult to think of something in the social, something that's radically changed in such a short period of time within our shared history of humankind. And I need to be careful, and as students will understand, check my privilege here, right? Because it's changed for me, and it's changed for a lot of people who live in cities who have accepting, tolerant parents, and so on and so forth. And we still have to be mindful. And I caveat everything I say by not just being mindful, but us always as a community being aware that what I speak about is my experience, and other people perhaps that have the same privilege, but there are young LGBTQ members of our shared community who are likely to experience homelessness at greater levels, mental health breakdown, so on and so forth. And that's still the case today. But my life, you have to understand, I say you have to understand, even that feels slightly mansplaining, but I can live with that. You know, the way in which I grew up in the 80s, Clause 28, it was illegal for teachers to talk about being gay, right? They could be sacked. All of the cultural representation of gay men and women was pretty negative. If you're a gay woman, if you're a lesbian, you know, you had the well of loneliness, right? That was nasty, brutish, and short. All mainstream depictions of a gay male identity were, again, presented through the prism of it won't end well, be that in big cultural presentations, let's say in the soap opera and so on and so forth, you know, they either died of AIDS or they were ostracized, right? But it was absolutely cloaked, and this is a critical thing, it was cloaked in shame and danger. And that's how our parents came to understand it too. So as you come to have that moment, or maybe there isn't an epiphany moment, as you evolve into your full personhood and you realized included in that buffet of things is your sexuality and you're gay, it becomes a very scary thing when everything you've been told and everybody, those who are around you have been told, is that it's shameful and you're going to die. And also all of the things, the options and the light, let's say, of being able to have marriage or a family or possibilities of equality in society that weren't available to you, meant that, you know, the entire narrative that your parents had hoped for you was then disappeared at the moment of your coming out. And so rather than them feeling this is an inclusive moment where all of the possibilities are available to my son, it's a moment inevitably of disappointment and of fear for a parent. And that was, of course, true in my case. So subsequent to me coming out, when I left university and I just started the bar, I was quite young, about 21 or 22. I had rubbish gay life at Manchester University, by the way. I really regret that. It's one of my only regrets. I could have had so much fun. I didn't do much gay clubbing, etc. And so, yeah, subsequently, over time, in this blink of a historical eye, you know, as we've moved slowly, not perfectly, but slowly towards equality, towards gradual social, not tolerance, a word I don't like, but social inclusion. It's meant that, you know, for me, I have to say in my professional life, etc., I haven't had experiences myself of homophobic prejudice.
Good.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You mentioned briefly Section 28, which was repealed, I think, in 2003,
Right.
which for most students now is before they were in school, before they started school. And I was just wondering what it felt like for you when that at that moment in time when it was repealed.
You know, I'm totally authentic. I try not to bullshit anybody, including students. I have to say, I remember it being repealed. I had my head down. I was trying to build a career at the bar doing criminal law and human rights law. And I remember thinking that's a moment. But I guess one of the things that's really important is I hadn't been cognizant or conscious, let's say, that of that restriction existing within my school. So on a personal level, it felt interesting. On a big national level, I was delighted by that moment. Did I have a kind of epiphany of yay? And people tell you that, you know, in the public eye, oh, it was a seminal moment. I went in the streets and thought, oh, did you fuck? You know what I mean? It was just, it felt, there were other moments, you know, which felt like that. You know, when my ex-husband was in the car and a significant political figure who he was working for at the time had voted to enable gay marriage. And I was driving along and my ex-husband got a text message from this particular person saying this is the proudest day in Parliament. And that felt like a moment. The idea that one day And that felt one day, from that moment of coming out to my mum, who inevitably, when you think about it, was facing her son thinking this is dangerous and miserable. Everything that society had imbibed and then projected onto the LGBTQ plus community. This is your life, the narrative you're going to live, right? The moment of gay marriage equality was a moment that felt like a breath of oxygen that changed the color of our communities and what was possible.
Yeah. So what interested you about a career in law? Do you think that had anything to do with it?
No. No, I went into my career mindlessly, and I come here and speak to alongside rather student groups all the time, and I have to adjust what I think. And I think you're an American student, right? So some of the things I'm going to say to you will, not necessarily kind of land in the same way. But you remember when I went to university, it was completely free. I mean, zilch. Tuition was totally paid for. You could even get a grant. I left university with £1,100 worth of debt. I mean, that's unthinkable nowadays. And I throat clear and tell you about that because the way that I approach my career, I wouldn't want anybody to think about doing nowadays, bearing in mind how much debt people get into and how tragically difficult it is for people to approach that experience of university in the privileged way that I did. What I mean by privilege, I was able, and my generation were able to have the experience of university free from the threat of what would ensue. In other words, being in a shitload of debt. In other words, you had that air to explore ideas of what you might want to do in a much freer way than I think students do nowadays in this country, bearing in mind the reality of the debt that they're going to get into and other things, right? So with that being said, I did debating at university and I got quite good at it. And everybody went to the bar who was good at debating. So I thought, well, I'll try that. I acted a little bit. I did one play, and the story, which is deadly true, I mentioned him before, but I thought I'd been in National Youth Theatre when I was about 14. I thought, oh, I'd be quite good at this. And went to audition, and then the person after me read, and I thought, wow, that's the real deal. I'm never going to be as good as him. And that was Benedict Cumberbatch. And I thought, yeah, forget about that. So I didn't act. I stopped acting on it. And I thought, well, yeah, seems to me like a career at the bar would be a good idea. I'd like to be an advocate. It's my skill set. I wasn't sure about being an academic. It's a way that I could blend together, let's say, a kind of academic life with being an advocate and a jury advocate. It seemed to me, suit my skill set. But, so I left university, did my law conversion and so on and so forth. Now, again, I mean, nowadays that would be unthinkable, right? Because you have to really think about what you're going to do, especially if you're going to come and do law, before you engage down that road. I mean, it was very competitive to get pupillage when I did it, but nowadays my chambers, which I'm still a member of and still teach, we have 200 to 400 applicants. We take 2 a year. And so I didn't really get imbued with a sense of mission and purpose as a barrister until I already started. And I remember going to my first case, thinking I wanted to be an advocate, and I'd only seen or been to a few court cases before. Nowadays, I mean, it's worth emphasizing, that's unthinkable. The experience we demand of applicants, that they've had a sense of not just the world, but they understand really that they're absolutely invested in this with mission and purpose, and they understand what they're getting into and why they're doing it. Again, that they've got a calling, a sense of why they want to be a criminal barrister. That's absolutely part and parcel of the application now. Whereas when I did it, yes, it was competitive, but you could just be good at debating. So it wasn't until I started really defending people and started seeing my first cases, I managed to get a pupillage without really having done any of that, that I realized what I was there doing, what motivated me was really to stand between the individual and the state, that the limitless power the state has to restrict, to take away somebody's liberty, was so powerful that if you as an individual could ensure, protect, preserve, and defend the standard that that was done to, that was the absolutely sort of central ethos of what I was engaged in. And then, of course, the dotted line at that moment to my grandfather, and it all kind of made sense in that puzzle, you know, who'd survived the Shoah, the Holocaust, and come to the UK. And like so many of the survivor community, those who have touched the face of tyranny have a special understanding, let's say, of what democracy under the rule of law is and what it was when you've had your liberty deprived, when you've not had food, when you've been in cold. There's a sense of, again, not a sense, but a complete a sacred relationship with freedom and how fragile it is. And so I'd already started work when I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. Nowadays, any of your listeners, you know, you can't go into to the bar tentatively like that. I'll just suck it and see. You know, well, I'll just go to, you know, I'll just go to law school and get into £70,000 worth of debt. Maybe I'll get a pupillage, maybe I won't. Yeah. And so, you know, I'm really conscious about that. And I've had to adjust how I talk to and listen to students nowadays. And often what I'm doing when people say they're interested in a career in the bar is I'm picking just how motivated they are, because you need to be way more now than you did in my generation.
Well, that's very helpful advice to me. Doing my law conversion next year. So thank you for that. And in terms of the law profession and the bar in particular, what is how's your experience been as someone who's Jewish and as a gay man in terms of the inclusivity of that profession?
Again, you know, I'm often asked this question, and there's a kind of degree of disappointment that I see in the interviewer, because they want me to kind of no, I don't think that's truly want me to. I think there's a sense in which I often am met with a slightly disappointed reaction when I say I personally didn't experience any anti-Semitism or any homophobia when I was at the bar. Now, what may have been said to me, were there structural things? Maybe, but I arrived at the bar 4 years ago. That's a moment. So what year were you born, you guys?
2000?
2003.
Okay, so I was doing a murder trial when you were born. That makes me feel super old. Eek. Yeah, yeah. So around the time you're born is when I started, and I had an incredible mentor, Malcolm Bishop, who was gay, deputy High Court judge. He and his partner were together for 50 years until his partner sadly died. And you know, a lot of the battles at the bar, especially the type of law I was practicing, had already kind of been fought by courageous activists before I got my feet under the table in chambers. So that's not to say there wasn't homophobia. There was. That's not to say there wasn't virulent sexism. There was, and there still is, and that's still something that we fail adequately to talk about. Certain cases, rapes and so on and so forth, or fraud, work that may have, I wasn't present when this was ever said in front of me, but you'll be generally aware of it, called girl work. Just think and pause about that. Yeah. And so that was an issue. But as for being Jewish, it never featured. That's not to say I didn't meet hostile clients. Not necessarily to me, but, you know, I represented, as is the job, you know, you represent people without fear or favor, regardless of their political inclination. I represented members of the National Front, for instance. On one occasion, I arrived and they thanked me because their solicitor had only sent Yids, queers, which wasn't the empowered word then that it is now. It was absolutely pejorative, and then used the P word to describe Asian people. It's not a word I'm going to amplify here, right? I mean, I did everything. He was glad that there were no Jews or queers, and I took all of my reserves not to go oy vey. And I represented this particular person because, again, it's worth remembering, and this is the thing that I think has been a real gift for me as social media has evolved and as I've ended up in the public sphere in a variety of different guises, is that, staring into the face of this particular family who had invested and continued to invest all of their residual energy, political, personal, social, in hate, negativity. These were not happy humans. You're staring into the abyss, this sort of sea of human debris, the chaos around them, this absolute unhappiness, complete lack of what we know to be joy or simcha. And that always stayed with me and struck me in later years when I have been the unhappy or happy beneficiary of negativity in whichever form on social media. I always smile and think, well, anybody that's anonymously behind the keyboard writing this nasty bile into the shared spaces of humankind, from whichever side of the political aisle or from whichever point of view, you can't be a happy human. Look around the people you know. I mean, do you really know anybody that would go online and write something hateful towards somebody, or who would stand and make a poster and so on and so forth in the same way? And so that was a good experience, let's say, for my career in the long run.
Yeah, so you are quite famous from your show, Judge Rinder. What was it like going from being a regular barrister to becoming famous in the field?
So yeah, what was it like? It was a complete random series of events. I didn't apply to be on telly, not even vaguely. I was instructed to prosecute the ex-government of the Turks and Caicos Islands, which I didn't really know where it was at that time, for the Foreign Office. So I only defended in this country, but in foreign cases I would prosecute. And doing that job on a desert island sounded like a great idea at the time. And then I got quite bored, so I used to write scripts. And in the hiatus between the investigative to the trial phase, I came back to defend in a case in Croydon. Got fairly miserable, if I'm honest. And I'd lost this lovely Yiddish word that I deploy and use all the time. It's such a rich language that has complete accuracy of feeling, but the koyach, the strength, actually it's a Hebrew word as well, but it makes more sense in Yiddish. To carry on defending in the way that I had with that much gusto. So I came back to defend in this big case in Croydon. I've written some scripts which were really bad. I went to sell one to ITV, to a woman I didn't know who she was, and she said it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. She gave it her aggressively undivided indifference, and I loved her. Went back to defend in this case in Croydon, wrote her an email, and she said, "Oh, this guy in Manchester's thinking of doing a court show. How's about it?" And I thought that sounded like fun. Went to meet him, and they were all in television. And as any of your people that you're going to speak, the people you're going to speak to about television will tell you, I mean, lots of people in television just talk, really, don't really do anything. They just go to meetings and divest themselves from the responsibility in the event things go badly and try to co-opt themselves into the decision in the event that things are a success, right? So people are sending emails and stuff, let's do this show. And that's normally unthinkable. Normally the germ of the idea of getting someone who's not on television onto television takes years. This woman just turned out to be a maverick commissioner at ITV. We didn't do a pilot or anything of that kind. In fact, I'd gone and taken a brief in Jersey advising the government of Jersey on their disclosure obligations because they had an independent care review into historic child abuse. So they needed someone at arm's length from the government to make sure the tribunal had all of the documents that they should have had. And I flew from Jersey, and then day one ended up flying to Manchester thinking this was all, can we say bullshit? But there you are. Thinking it was never going to happen. And there was a court with my name on it, and I was sufficiently qualified to arbitrate these disputes, and they're all civil disputes. A woman suing her wedding photographer. Thank you. I'm very glad that you brought your mum to court. That's my sister. So on and so forth. But at the core of all of those cases, which, just in case your viewers have any doubt, and I can understand why with some of the things that have ended up on TikTok, they were all real. And even the most, as you'll come to discover in your legal studies, even cases that seem the most silly on the face of their facts can be really legally complicated. So that's how it all happened. And then from there, very unusually, because they tried to launch a lot of daytime shows, and it's rare that they hit the public imagination, let's say. And this became an overnight hit way over 10 years ago. And that's what happened. And then from there, you get the privilege of doing lots of other things. So be it dancing on Strictly or making documentaries about the Shoah or Israel Palestine, presenting Good Morning Britain from time to time, but or taking Ryland as I have last summer around Italy on the Grand Tour, or series about prisons, or Princess in the Tower. All of the work I do is fundamentally similar to being a barrister, about enabling the broadest group and the broadest communities to feel empowered in culture, in some social issue, to feel that that issue belongs to them. They can know it, and what's more, they can share in it. And when it comes to culture, they can delight in it in whichever way. In other words, enabling, as broadcasting can do at its best, us to understand each other better.
So speaking of some of the other work you've done since then, what was it like creating the documentary that you did on the Shoah, and what draws you into kind of Holocaust education in that way?
Yeah, it's a big question. Well, I did a Who Do You Think You Are first. And it's an interesting thing. With the moment we're reflecting on the background of how much, the level of threat towards our Jewish communities, right? My Who Do You Think You Are episode, where I discovered a lot more of the background of my grandfather. And as I say, he was a survivor, but I only knew, despite having gone back with him to Poland, where I had the most extraordinary experiences in 1998, I really hadn't coloured in the outlines of his life. And of course, that rich Jewish tradition going back centuries in Poland, where he had lived. But this is a very big discussion for a whole nother podcast, right? You asked a very big question. So, it's worth knowing that in the group that I'm looking at, the Radio Times, of the other people who were in the group of people whose lives they were following, backgrounds in Who Do You Think You Are, I was probably the least famous, and yet when the story was broadcast, it had about 2.5 as many viewers as any of the others. Now, it wasn't because they were tuning in to find out about me. It was because there was a genuine social and community interest, a curiosity, a thirst to understand and to know more. And I just actually sort of, who was there? Olivia Colman, Boy George, and Lee Mack, and so on and so forth. And so from there, I mean, it demonstrated just how we could share the stories and the various lessons of the show on a broader palette, and that there was a broad social interest. And by the way, this wasn't just London, it was across the country from a variety of different communities. One of the things the BBC does really well is its analyticals in that regard, of who the audience is. And so I wanted to be part of, and it wasn't, I was part of curating the narrative, but I didn't make the film, of making a bigger program. So we made The Holocaust, My Family and Me, which I encourage people to watch. It's now taught in 240 schools, which I'm really proud of. And it's very difficult to, so again, a long answer, but it's important, how do we choose the stories we will follow when there are so many? And ostensibly there are 3 elements to it. It's second generation, and third in my case, right? It was to try and explore a variety of different elements through the prism of story. I think has the most important and powerful influence of how we can communicate one another, especially when we meet intransigence or somebody who we're trying to share who we are, an idea with, who might be hostile to us. So those stories, each element had to be there. So all of the stories, apart from my own, take place in Western Europe. And that's very important because often the Shoah, the Holocaust, is presented through the black and white prism of history, or exclusively as an Eastern European lived experience. And that's very difficult. You will encounter this. Perhaps you have Holocaust survivors in your family, and you're responsible for that element of Jewish life and lived experience in your portfolio, so to speak, in what you do in UJS. And you'll meet people that will say, I've been to Auschwitz, as if that's the beginning and the end of the story. But what we fail to do is to remember that that's the end of the story. And what we need to focus on now more than ever is the beginning. This emerges, this takes shape, it takes roots in the most advanced liberal democracy in the world. So the stories take place in lives that have a similar echo to our lived experience now in Holland and Germany and in France. And so that was important. And we touch on rescuers, lots of people from our community and beyond, especially from beyond, like to understandably cast themselves in the heroic narrative that, confronted by the horrors of the Shoah and the gradual constrictions of freedom, they would have made the courageous choice. But actually, what did it take? So speaking the community up, having that element in one of the stories, talking about trauma. So each of the generations, and this has been one of the most important impacts in terms of how people have responded to the program from a variety of different communities, how when you, as young as you can learn language, you also learn the limitations of what you can and can't talk about. And that's particularly prevalent within our Jewish community, whether you have a Holocaust survivor or not, that we are all of us in a variety of different ways, the unhappy beneficiary of inherited trauma. So how does that play out in families where you don't talk about things? And of course, I say of course, it's darkly of course, but the death by bullets, which again isn't discussed as well. So the complete picture. And so as you may have seen, I interviewed a woman who had witnessed a massacre in which ancestors of mine had been murdered. And I interviewed her, and I'm a Russian speaker, and it was the most extraordinary moment. But that's the work. And as I say, the good thing about it wasn't just a program, it was widely watched, but now it's been taken up by UCL, Holocaust Education Center, and a variety, well, led by Dr. Nick Wetherall. And it's now taught in a variety of different schools from all backgrounds, which is really something to behold. And 2 weeks ago, I was in the Imperial War Museum, and it's a number of different schools, faith schools, Muslim majority schools. And what they do is they take one of the stories and they piece the lives together. They rebreathe life into the people who were lost, at the same time as exploring all of the underlying reasons why people ended up in Treblinka or Sobibor or Auschwitz. And they take that into the world in a courageous way. What I mean by that is, they become not just allies, but they have the tools to understand where hate leads. And it's an enormously powerful thing to watch how empowered these young learners are and how what they become as they go into their communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We on the podcast, we do normally towards the end we do quick fire questions, which is just kind of a bit of fun. So
sorry, I've been really long-winded. It's just these are, they're not straightforward. I really hope that your listeners get a chance to watch that. Anyway.
No, thank you so much. And I think for a lot of students in particular now, Holocaust education and really educating peers about what happened in the Shoah is really important.
But you see, I'm going to ask you a question, because what happened in the Shoah, I understand is one of the elements, frightening and dark, that has emerged is denial, right? Equivalence and so on and so forth. denigration and so on, all of those things. What about a room, let's say. And I wonder how you advocate where you encounter that. You know, it's the most extraordinary thing that as I speak to you, my water, you're more likely to encounter anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitism on campus than I did, having been to university quarter of a century ago. So I wonder what you do in the context of Holocaust education to change that. And I also wonder where you begin, because it isn't the pictures of Auschwitz, the horrors of the limitless horrors of that volcano and the dark landscape of that genocide, but I think changes hearts and minds. I wonder about how you discuss the beginning of that story, the bits where we are now, the gradual dehumanization of Jews, you know, the language that's deployed, and so on and so forth, how gradually, you know, it may begin in universities, how places and sources of power educate and change what and how people think. That, I think, is an important thing to be thinking about, discussing in the context of the show. In other words, the slide into Treblinka, standing on that earth where I did with the last survivor, didn't happen overnight. As we were making Kaddish and he touched my arm and said, "This is for Kol Yisrael, all the living people of the world." Remember that a camp guard in Treblinka in 1943, let's say he was 22, would have been roughly 12 or 13, would have had a decade's worth of propaganda before standing in that, on that earth. So to me, the very big, so when you say use the Holocaust, it can't just be about this was a terrible event, unimaginable in its modernity, especially in the horror of humankind, but this is how it started. You need to know this. You know, that's the thing.
Yeah. No, that's really powerful stuff. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
But we will go to the quick fire questions now, if that's all right. Just as kind of a bit of fun, I guess. Yeah.
Well, who is your biggest role model?
Professional or life?
Either one.
Okay, so role model, it's not difficult. My mum, you know, single mum. You want to talk about somebody confronting prejudice, you know. She started a business in the 1980s. People would go and talk to her taxi driver and negotiate with him, you know. She muscled her way through life, and a word, again, another Yiddish word that I just love sharing, and it's the connective tissue between all of the survivors, most of whom survived because of luck, except one thing they all have in common is this word dovka. Yiddish, it kind of means to be contrarian, but I don't mean in a, you know, in a kind of annoying sort of obnoxious way. The sky is blue, the sky is black. You know, I'm talking about somebody who has been born with a life that's been written for them, that society has projected a narrative onto them, and you say, "Hey, no, F you," I grab the pen. And my mum always did that in life. And I feel that's just about the most powerful thing you can do. And that's why she's my role model. And, you know, professionally, a number of them, but Malcolm Bishop, who I refer to, who was a deputy high court judge and a gay man living openly at the bar for a long period of time. And a bunch of other activists who were, you know, came before me, including people who I often very much disagree with now, but who I love deeply, Peter Tatchell and so on and so forth.
Thank you. The next one is, have you got a favorite Jewish food?
Oh, schmaltz herring. I'm all about the schmaltz. I traveled across Russia before the invasion of Ukraine, and honestly, as I went across Siberia, I felt I'd arrived in a culinary way. I have the taste buds of a kind of 18th century chassid living beyond the pale. Like my absolute full-on desert island food would be the schmaltziest schmaltz herring with a glass of vodka or scotch. I mean, yeah, I could pretty much survive on that.
Wow. And then if you hadn't become a lawyer, what would you be?
I don't know. It's so difficult because I do so many things nowadays. I write novels and I'm a lawyer and I even, did panto at Bristol. So I've been, um, I've tried all of the things that I wanted to do and might have become. And because I'm, have this ridiculous gift of being able to do all of these things. I was reporting from the border in the Ukraine, Poland, from the Polish border in the beginnings of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've even been a war correspondent for a short period of time. So I can't answer that question because I am all of the things that I would have done.
Mm.
I know, I feel so lucky. It's actually ridiculous. I might have been I suppose I might have been a lecturer or a teacher.
Oh, thank you. And the final question is, have you got one piece of advice that you would give to a Jewish student today?
One piece of advice. What resilience is about is not enabling the outside world to determine your narrative. Dovka, you grab the pen, you hold it. Whatever story the world around you is projecting, writing on your behalf. Whatever threat, remember, fuck you, you hold the pen. Your story, your power. And there's an impulse, that's my advice, I'm going to stop there. Because there's an impulse, understandably, as Jews from every tradition, we're not optimistic people. We've been genetically selected, let's say, for pessimism. I mean, those who said it'll all be over by Hanukkah, generally speaking, in our history, didn't live to see Hanukkah, right? Probably in our RNA, and we now know actually there's a good chance it is. And so going into the world with resilience requires hope and optimism, but it also requires you to go have the muscle to say, actually, you don't get to force me into a position where I'm going to live my life furtively as a Jew, or I'm going to live in fear or take my kamar off or my mezuzah. No. I get to write my narrative. I get to be a Jew in the world, and I get to do it with pride and with gusto and with my expression. I hold the pen. And until you know that you can hold the pen too, none of us can be free.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, so I feel like we've covered a lot. Thank you so much for talking to us about
It's a
your
pleasure.
Jewish identity, your career, your LGBT identity as well. I feel like
I've not been very well, so I feel a bit like I banged on a bit. So sorry, students. I hope you
it's been really interesting for me at least. So I'm sure that our students will feel the same way. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, and thank you, UJS students, and carry on being courageous and brave and proud, and being advocates. So it's one of the things I really hope to work alongside UJS more, is how can we be advocates for our communities, because we're not, we're not one identity. We're a delicious buffet, a rainbow, a menorah of different identities, all with the same root but with different lights. How can we do that? And the starting point, which I see UJS doing all the time, is the impulse for courage. And so I want to thank you, UJS, because as you asked me who my hero was. No, my role model, one of my heroes is Maya Angelou. She said such a beautiful thing, and it's so true. You can't practice any of the virtues consistently, right, without courage. And it's a curious thing as I sit here, and I never thought I'd see it, I'd imagine it, to tell those running UJS that you need courage in the world. But you do, and it's an enormous gift that you have, and I want to thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. That's really appreciated. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more podcasts, and you can keep up to date via our social media at UJS_UK.